Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us at Griffin's Virtual Expo this year. We so look forward to being back together again next year, but are really happy that you're participating. We're excited to bring you a special talk today. We are going to have a Q&A with Griffin CEA experts. We have curated a number of common questions and also collected some submissions from sales reps and customers, and we're going to go through those today. With us, we have Peter Armando, our CEA business developer, and Erica Hernandez, our CEA GGS Pro technical specialist. Hi, Peter and Erica.
Good afternoon, guys.
Let's get rolling with this. Let's start with a general question. Peter, what are ways that customers can diversify their business and get into growing CEA crops such as lettuce, veggies, or strawberries?
Yeah, thanks, Tammy. So it's pretty easy if you have idle greenhouse space. Just using simple potted plant containers, you could grow lettuce on a bench in a cooler greenhouse. You could use 1 meter grow bags and grow strawberries, lettuce, tomatoes, eggplant, anything in that environment. So you can use your idle greenhouse space to extend the growing season using simple setups in the irrigation system. It could be as simple as what you're using currently for a mum crop.
So if somebody wants to get into it, they don't need to make a tremendous capital investment to give it a try and see how it works for their market.
No, most customers probably already have the materials to do it. It's just the idea and putting it together, the plan together.
And if they don't know the specific needs of the crop, Erica, that's when you can come into the picture, correct?
Yeah, definitely. So lettuce, strawberries, herbs, those are all pretty well understood and pretty popular crops. So there's a lot of information out there on environmental requirements, on nutritional requirements, and that's something that GGS Pro really specializes in is, keeping track of what industry practices are for these various crops and helping growers implement them in their facilities.
Great. Now let's talk a little bit about cannabis and hemp. Nick Hopkins, our CEA customer service rep in Denver, was wondering, is there a difference or what are the differences that growers should be considering when they're looking at or thinking about growing an indoor cannabis or hemp crop versus an outdoor cannabis or hemp crop? And Peter and Erica, I think you probably both have some thoughts on this one.
Yeah, so when it comes to indoor versus outdoor crops, I mean, this is going to apply to pretty much any crop that you can grow indoor versus outdoor. There are some specific things that we want to think about with cannabis and hemp, but our main things are there's a big difference in environment between the indoor and outdoor crop, of course. One is protected agriculture in your greenhouse or even in your high or low tunnels. And another is the ability to control both lighting that your plants are exposed to in indoor versus being at the mercy of Mother Nature outdoors, as well as your pest control strategies change a bit when it comes to indoor versus outdoor. We definitely tend to see a difference in pests that outdoor cannabis crops and hemp crops will experience versus what we see indoors in the greenhouse. So outdoors, our biggest worry that we tend to come across are caterpillars. There's pretty widespread caterpillar action in the field when it comes to cannabis and hemp, unfortunately. But when we move into the greenhouse, we typically don't see caterpillars at all. So that's pretty interesting. It's a big difference there and can change the type of products that you might want to expose your crop to or use on your crop. Whereas indoors, you'll see things like spider mites and thrips, pretty standard greenhouse pests. Another big thing is that, as I said, you're at the mercy of Mother Nature for your lighting outdoors. So typically, growers will only be growing a cannabis and hemp crop outdoors during the summer and the fall, maybe a little bit in the spring. because cannabis is very sensitive to photoperiod, or the amount of light, the amount of hours that your crop is exposed to light. Whereas in the greenhouse, we've got more options to control, how many hours of light your plants are under, the intensity, things like that. So greenhouse growers tend to be able to grow year round to a certain extent, whereas outdoor, that's mostly going to be a spring, summer, fall production.
Peter, what about quality of the harvest, of the product produced? Is there a difference between indoor and outdoor?
There's a big difference. So indoor will produce better quality. We know for a fact we can get equal yields inside and out. But the protection of the environment in a greenhouse, as Erica says, gives you much better control. The other thing I would point out here is the plant is kind of like, I always like to use the term a goldfish. It grows to what we try to create in the container of the environment. So if a crop is planted outside very early with the way the photoperiod works, you can end up with tremendously large plants, which can be torn apart in the weather. So there's a lot has to be done in scheduling, spacing, and timing on the outside to get the size plant to fit the area that you're trying to, and actually be able to work on the crop and spray it and stuff. Same goes on the inside. We can grow everything from a 1 gallon container all the way up to a 25, 30 gallon container. So that's key on a lot of this.
Great. So it sounds like a bit more control indoors over what we're working to achieve since we have control of that environment.
That's correct.
Okay. Our next question is one, Erica, I think you get this all the time. Which media is best for growing cannabis?
All right, you're right. I do get this question a lot, Tammy, and it's sort of a tough question to answer because I don't feel like there really is a right answer here. It really depends on your production space, your production style, and how you're going to be applying your nutrients, how your irrigation is set up, and the size plant that you're shooting for. So typically, the different types of media that growers use, they might be a peat-based media, like our ProMix on the left there. We've got core, coconut core, which is basically shredded coconut husk. In the middle, you can see an example of that with Jiffy and the pre-filled bags. And on the right side, we've got stuff like Grodan rock wool, which is a more manufactured media. And really, what comes into play here is how we're going to measure our nutrients and how much our media is going to hold on to. With peat-based medias and soil medias, we tend to find that our EC salts tend to stick around a bit more. Our EC and our pH really come into play measuring inside the media. And growers who are trying to promote a quote unquote living soil environment where we're really promoting a big diversity in the microbiome in the soil, oftentimes we'll choose something like peat. However, if we're looking for more of a hydroponic style production, where we're really going to be controlling our EC and our pH in the fertigation solution in our fertilizer water, we have growers who tend to choose a coconut core or rock wool because those medias are pretty easy to flush out. They're going to be, the environment is going to be highly determined by the pH and EC of your fertigation solution. And a lot of times, growers will choose these if they're going for precision irrigation style production.
Peter, you do a lot of work with new growers and new facilities. And to Erica's point, there is no one perfect media for the cannabis crop itself. Is there something that's more forgiving for a new grower?
We tend to always start with the bagged medias, like the ProMix HP or HPCC. It just gives us a little bit easier to start with hand-holding a customer going through. And then as they advance, we move to the other products.
That makes sense. Now, related to media, Jonathan Prime, one of our salespeople up in the Northeast, was wondering about the difference between mycorrhizae and bacterial amendments. Erica, do you have thoughts on this? What do people need to understand about these products?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different products out there that try to promote, increasing the diversity in the microbiome and the root zone. And they also promote a variety of different benefits. So understanding these different products can be a little difficult. So let's start with a couple of definitions. So what are mycorrhizae and mycorrhizal products? So mycorrhizae are actually beneficial fungi that grow in the soil and form close associations between plant roots and their the fungal development. So these fungi can either be inside or outside root tissue, and typically what they do is they will increase dramatically the surface area available to roots, and they'll enable the plants to take up more water, take up more nutrients. And it's a symbiotic relationship because the plant will get that water and nutrients, and the fungi actually get sugar from the plant roots as exudates as the plant grows and takes up that water and nutrients. They will release sugars to the fungi. So that's what mycorrhizal products are. They're basically beneficial fungi. So what about the bacterial amendments? So typically when we're talking about bacterial amendments, we're talking about rhizobacteria, or bacteria that specialize in colonizing plant roots. These are also symbiotic. So you might have heard these referred to as PGPRs, plant growth promoting rhizobacteria as well. These tend to colonize the root surface, and in some cases, with some species, they'll form root nodules too, like we see in beans, things like that. And oftentimes they'll do things like perform nitrogen fixation. They may also induce systemic resistance in plants, so they play a role in resisting disease as well. And they will also colonize to such an extent that they actually exclude pathogens. So telling the difference between these two, oftentimes, we have to keep in mind that one is fungal, which is the mycorrhizae, and the other relies on bacteria. So they're two different types of organisms. And they may have similar components to them, but oftentimes mycorrhizae do not have anything to do with disease control. And a lot of times our bacterial amendments do have some component in pest resistance or disease control. So that's a big difference.
Let's shift gears. Let's talk about lettuce for a little bit. A common problem in lettuce is tip burn, like we're seeing in this picture. Erica, it looks nutritional. Is this a nutritional problem?
All right, so yes, this is a nutritional problem to a certain extent, in that you have to understand what's actually causing the tip burn. So when we see tip burn issues, this is coming from a lack in calcium at those developing tissues. So calcium's needed when we're building healthy cell walls. And the only way calcium can get through the plant is to be carried via water while the plant is transpiring. So when we see something like tip burn, you might think initially like, oh, I don't have enough calcium in my fertilizer solution, but oftentimes that's not the case. Oftentimes you've got plenty of calcium. It's just that your plant is not able to transpire fast enough, or just enough in general, to get that calcium moving through the plant and arriving at your newly developed tissue. So what can cause that? We really want to take a look at environmental conditions primarily that might limit your transpiration. And first and foremost, what we see is imbalances in your relative humidity in the crop. Now that's going to limit your transpiration ability of your plants, because the higher your relative humidity is in your growing area, your plants aren't going to be able to transpire as much because transpiration relies on the evaporation of water out of the plant through stomates. And if there's already a lot of water in the air, you're not going to see a lot of transpiration happening. So that's number one. Take a look at your relative humidity. Number two, oftentimes, high light environments might lead to this as well. So especially with lettuce can grow really fast if you provide a lot of light, but water and calcium can only move so fast through the plant. So if you're providing a lot of light and if your plant is growing really fast, but you're still seeing these tip burn issues, you're probably just outpacing the ability of calcium to move through the plant.
Peter, there are certain conditions that are likely to cause issues with humidity in the greenhouse. Are there some particular ones that you can identify for us? And what are some of the things that people will do with equipment in the greenhouse to mitigate and prevent the tip burn that we're seeing here?
So the biggest thing here is as Eric has stated, this crop likes it cool and dry. So the idea is to create an environment to do that. So in certain times of the year, they can use chilled water or ways to cool the air environment, especially in the summer months. Have very good airflow, not just horizontally, but vertically in the space as well. And also, it could even take adjustments in the fertilizer programs based on the time of the year and the way the light levels are. You know, in the fall and the winter, we're much darker, requires supplemental light. And in the summer times, we may shade more in the middle of the day to reduce light levels and heat stress.
So this is a situation where it's fairly complex, and we're bringing together on our team people with different skill sets to help solve the problems in total. So thanks for sharing your thoughts on that. We're going to stick with the fertilizer thoughts for a little bit, and this one is always a fun subject. Where did the phosphorus myth come from, and why is it a myth? Erica, I know this is one of your favorite subjects, but Peter, can you talk us through why cannabis growers, what is the phosphorus myth first, and how did they get to this place?
Well, they feel in order to develop the bud on the backside, they need a high phosphorus level. And quite frankly, the way the cannabis industry was taught was put all the feed you possibly can in the pot for the crop to grow and then wash the excess out or flush it out so that you don't miss the chance to feed the plant. And so there's always been this rule to get a bigger, stronger bud, you need a ton of phosphorus.
And Erica, why are we understanding now that this is not the case?
Yeah, so one of the things that's been really exciting with legalization in multiple different areas, either of hemp or cannabis, is that we're seeing a lot more university research taking place now, where other crops have been really fully studied, maybe not fully studied, but thoroughly studied. And we understand a lot about nutrient requirements and pretty much like everything about those crops. For cannabis, we haven't had the opportunity to have that research yet. Now, what we're seeing is we have a couple of different institutions who are doing pretty significant fertilizer and nutrition research into cannabis, and they've definitely taken a look at phosphorus requirements of cannabis and hemp in multiple different environments. And what they're finding is cannabis really doesn't need very high levels of phosphorus. What they found in some recent research papers that have been published is that, in all honesty, we're looking at 15 to 30 parts per million phosphorus to achieve normal bud development, normal plant growth, everything like that. And going any higher either hurts the plant, depending on the strain, or simply doesn't provide any additional benefit. We might see a little bit more vegetative growth or more dry mass, but we don't see additional THC production, additional CBD production. We're not seeing effects like that. So when growers are providing a really high level of phosphorus at the end of the production cycle, what that's doing, depending on the strain, is that phosphorus might just be going down the drain. Or in worst case scenario, because we have a lot of strains out there, some strains are more sensitive to higher fertilizer levels or specific nutrient levels. And if we apply too much phosphorus, we may see a negative impact. So it really depends on the strain, but research is showing now that we really don't require those high levels to get our big buds or to get our normal development. It's really all about genetic selection here.
Good to know. If we stick with cannabis, for our next question that we get a lot from our customers as well, they're curious about the differences between seed and clone production. And Peter and Erica, both of you I know have thoughts on this, whether it's related to scheduling or if it's related to fertility and environmental conditions. Peter, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, so there's really a big difference between the two. First of all, seed production. This crop is still in its infancy, so the genetics aren't there yet. So when you're seeding the crop out, there's going to be quite a variation between plant to plant as you're planting it out in the crop, not only characteristic wise, far as shape and development and the structures of the plants, but even in the levels of the THC and say CBD later on down the road. They're not exact copies. Seed production usually takes about a month from the time you drop seed to the time that you transplant it out. And so it's a little bit more of a process. They tend to get a little bit more stretched and stuff, and you do not have that uniformity. Whereas a clone or a cutting, you're taking an exact copy of a plant that you can be tested. You know the true values of that plant, and you're just making a bunch of copies of it. So there the crop will be identical across the board. The only
Great.
drawback is that takes time. You have to create a mother stock, which will take probably 3 to 6 months in order to be able to take the clones you need to create the process.
So that's something to think about if you are going to be generating your own clones, is you have to have the environment and the technical knowledge to grow those stock plants.
That is correct, or work with Griffin or a valued supplier that sells rooted cuttings so that you have guaranteed success.
Mm-hmm.
No different than you do in your ornamental flowers.
Peter, thanks for helping us understand that. That's going to be very informative for people when they're working to decide what their business model will be. When it comes to clones, there are a lot of opinions of what that cutting should look like. I've seen things that were really big. I've seen things that were really small. Can you guys, Peter and Erica, talk to this a little bit and help people understand, is this about the number of nodes? How big do you want the cutting to be?
Yeah. So the cannabis industry, like you mentioned, it has its own practices that have traditionally differed from other horticultural crops. Many growers, like you said, they'll take cuttings that are up to 6 to 8 inches long. That's a pretty typical one that you'll see from a lot of growers. While others might take cuttings to the point on the stem where growth is a bit tougher. So they've got a more rigid cutting, but they're not shooting for something that is so tall. So that might be more like 4 to 5 inches in length. Whereas other, ornamental horticulture crops, oftentimes we're taking cuttings as small as 2 to 3 inches. This really depends on, what crop it is. But, 2 to 3 inches wouldn't be unheard of for a lot of crops. This size, can be determined by a couple things. It can be determined by internode spacing, or it could be relying on the most recently mature leaf size. It's another thing we want to look at. What practices that growers will shoot for is A lot of times they try to select a cutting where they'll be able to have 1 to 2 nodes stuck into the media with at least one set of leaves left below the growing point. They also will be using rooting hormone as well to promote development of roots both at the node and in the internode space. Now, I know, Peter, you had mentioned that you had some thoughts on this as well, so I wanted to hear a little bit more about what you were saying here.
Yeah, so two things I'd like to point out to back up a little. The treatment of the mother plant almost dictates the quality of the cutting. So if the mother plant isn't adequately taken care of, or if she's water stressed prior to the cuttings being taken, this can highly affect how the quality of the cutting and the rootability of it is down the road. Now, the other thing is this industry prior to likes to what I call scratch the surface of the bottom of the stem to try to promote root growth and stuff. Working in this arena, we have seen that that is not necessary. The plant will root out naturally if the right rooting hormone is used. The plant does sometimes require a better, little stockier plant rather than a smaller, what I would call softer tissue cutting, and that kind of all boils back down how that mother plant is taken care of. Far as the number of internodes and stuff, that's going to dictate the crop you're looking for down the road. Are you growing a straight shot with one cola, or you are looking at a bigger branch plant? So it kind of all plays into this initial first step of what you're trying to do.
So it sounds like we want to make sure we have a cutting that is appropriately of the appropriate age, grown on a healthy stock plant to make it something that will be better able to more easily, more rapidly root.
Yes. Now I'm going to ask Erica the question. Erica, what's your thoughts of when you see people cupping the leaf surface of a cutting?
Cupping the leaf surface, like cutting the
They take
ends.
they take a razor blade, set this cutting down and roll the blade around and cut all the tips off of those mature leaves at the bottom. It
So
is widely used in
yeah,
this industry.
that is a widely used practice, and I have a couple of thoughts about that. My ultimately, I feel pretty neutral about this. So part of the reason why people do that is to cut down on the total leaf surface that's available, because we want to cut down on transpiration. We want to cut down on water loss. And we still want to have some leaf surface because we still want that plant photosynthesizing. But sometimes the only leaves that your cuttings are left with are kind of big, so they want to cut that down. But while that might be an effective way to cut down on leaf surface and transpiration, you're also creating a wound in the plant where there's more opportunity for bacterial or fungal infection to take hold. Now, if your operation is fairly clean and you're not seeing a lot of issues with bacterial or fungal infections early in production, then go for it. Like I said, I feel pretty neutral about this. It really depends on their workflow and if they are having issues with disease in their clone operation.
When we're rooting our cuttings, how long should we expect that it will take for a full root system like we see here to develop? What do you think, Erica?
Well, from cutting to a fully rooted liner or plug like what we see here, you're probably looking at 2 to 3 weeks max. What we want to see is that early on we're going to see some callus development, which is the wound of the cutting healing and the tissue developing areas for root development in the cutting. We'll see that in about the first week to 10 days. And then we start to see root initials forming in 10 to 14 days with the first little roots, popping out and developing. And finally, we see these, full, really nice root development. It happens really fast. Once we have that callus development, and the root initials, we see that this plant roots very quickly, and that root system will develop very quickly.
So I'm assuming there could be some variety in time to root based on genetics, but it sounds like in general, if you're not seeing nice healthy roots develop by about day 14 or so, that you probably have a problem in the crop.
If we're not seeing some initial root development by day 14, if we're not seeing that we can take our hoods off, our humidity domes, and if we're seeing that the plant is still wilting and looking water stressed at that point, something's definitely wrong.
Good to know. That's when it's time to call you, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Peter, you had mentioned a few minutes back that some growers want to produce one large cola versus other growers who might be growing more of a multi-branch plant with more lateral buds. So as we've seen in cannabis, unlike something like mums or poinsettia, there is no single way to do this. There's a lot of variety in the approaches that growers take. Why would somebody choose to go for one primary stem, one primary cola versus a branched approach?
So it all boils down to labor. So if you were going for one large cola, so if you're looking for smokable flower, you're looking for a high quality bud. So if they're growing in a smaller pot, so to speak, and they want to do a fast turn on the crop, they may go straight for one big cola. But you also have a huge production cost. You need more liners to produce more plants in smaller containers. Whereas if you go to a multi-branch pot and you're growing in, say, a 5-gallon pot, you now could have 6 or 7 lateral branches that you'd have to do some thinning and some cleaning to get those higher quality, multi-head colas on the top to have smokable flower. So it really becomes the operation and the market they're looking for. And some varieties, quite frankly, they don't want to grow small. They are a larger species that needs a lot of space and a lot of room to grow to get that quality. So that's why you come up that way with the larger bud on some of them. Every plant will produce on the highest stems a large cola, and then you get a lot of side shoots, which in the industry referred to as popcorn buds, just
Okay.
not as high quality.
So a couple of different ways to do it depending on your style of grow and depending on your genetics. And a couple different ways to get to the yield that you might be looking for.
And that's what ultimately what it is growers are trying to get, the end goal is the highest yield per plant per square foot.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of ways to finish that race.
Mm-hmm. So they can go after yield, and they're also wanting to maximize either their CBD or their THC in cannabis crops. Erica, how can we increase the levels of those secondary compounds?
Yeah, so this is a common question that we get a lot, and there's also a lot of products out there that will make claims that we can boost THC, we can boost CBD. And right now, unfortunately, with cannabis and hemp, we don't really understand those mechanisms too well. What this is ultimately going to come down to are two things. And the first is going to be variety selection. So every variety is going to respond to different conditions differently. We've seen that a lot. But once you have a variety and you understand the THC production, the CBD production in that variety, you're probably only going to be able to shift those percentages, a percentage point or two one way or the other. You're not going to see big shifts. So say you've got a 25% THC strain, you're probably only going to be able to get it up to 26 or 27% reliably if you find a very highly targeted product that happens to work with that strain. If you're looking to increase your levels of CBD and THC, oftentimes your fastest way to make that shift is to select a different variety that has the levels that you're looking for, rather than trying to take a lower producing variety and bump it up. The other thing that we have to think about is time. So as your flowers are developing and ripening, as you can see in this graph here at the bottom right, we've got weeks after flower, and these two lines both represent the green is the CBD levels, and the blue is the THC levels in a hemp plant. And that red line there, that's the 0.3% THC threshold that we don't want to cross for hemp. So as we can see, for different weeks after flower, we can see that those levels are steadily increasing. So depending on how long you want to let your crop go, you will see that those THC and CBD levels will climb. You can let a crop go longer if you're trying to increase levels, but at some point it's going to max out due to its genetics. So understanding how your particular variety develops through its weeks after flower initiation, that's going to be important for understanding this as well.
Okay, good to know. And I presume that at the foundation of all of this is healthy plant growth, that we are giving it the right nutrition, that we're giving it the right irrigation, that we're controlling our pests.
Oh, yes, definitely. So we want to make sure we've got our nutrition spot on. We want to make sure that we don't have stressed out plants, because when our plants get stressed out, we start to see strange things happening. So,
Yep. All right. Speaking of pests, specifically, we get a lot of questions about root aphids and how they can fight them. Erica, you get these questions daily, don't you?
I do. Root aphids are one of the biggest things that we're seeing right now at this time of year, but also just in general. Root aphids seem to be the plague of cannabis and hemp in the greenhouse and growth chambers. And Peter, what are you seeing out there in the field when you see the plants that are affected?
It's just not hemp and cannabis. We're seeing it a lot in NFT channels and lettuce and other crops. And one of the biggest things I usually tell the grow teams is it's not just a facility sanitation practice, it's an employee sanitation practice. So your employees or anybody who comes into your facilities are the vectors of some of these problems, even salesmen like myself. So you have to take that all in account when you're trying to combat problems like these. So they need to look far and wide, because yes, it's in a lettuce facility, it's kind of, and it's an NFT system. There isn't many options. It's pretty much try to get it out of the building and start again, clean and reset.
And that brings up a really good point. Like, what are the most common ways that people go after root aphids, Erica? What are some of the things that we see work, and are there any tricks to how these solutions might be applied to make them more effective?
Yeah, well, root aphids, they're pretty much exactly where you expect to find them, in the roots. They colonize basically the entire root system, could be the entire container profile. And our best way to get at them are typically insecticide drenches. We do have some growers who try to go after them with BCAs, and there is a limited efficacy there. So things like Delocia or Atheta beetles will prey on root aphids, as well as stratiolaelaps. But the issue is that oftentimes those BCAs are really only on the surface of the media, or maybe a little bit inside of the container. So they don't always, penetrate deep enough to get to all of the different little pockets of root aphids. Whereas a drench, we can do a full container drench and hopefully penetrate a bit deeper into the media with enough drench volume to really coat those root aphids and get all those little pockets in there. And we'll use things like Bavaria bassiana products, which is an insecticidal fungi. We'll use things like azadirachtin, an insect growth regulator, and also, of course, Eiseria species as well, another insecticidal fungi. So those are the big things that we see.
Very good. How might scouting help people in their production? And what is scouting, Erica?
Yeah, so you mentioned scouting once or twice already. So, what is that? Scouting, this is a pretty basic definition here. Scouting is the process of inspecting crops for signs of disease, insect, or nutritional issues. And this is really a central part of keeping a crop healthy from beginning to end. Oftentimes, we'll see growers who scout weekly or even daily. And yes, this is labor intensive, but effective scouting can really help to prevent issues way down the line. You can identify disease or insect issues right at the beginning when you start to see them moving in and before an issue is really taken hold in the crop. And that's the best time to deal with an issue before you're seeing any economic thresholds being crossed or any like really tenacious insects or mites taking place or taking hold. So when you're scouting, you definitely want to do a full plant scout. So we're talking, the foliage at the very top of the crop, all the way down to the bottom of the crop into the roots, because we've got things like root aphids. So we want to see, what do the roots look like? Are they looking damaged or stressed? Are we seeing visible signs of insects on the roots or on the leaves? Those are the kind of things we want to keep in mind when we're scouting.
Great. And what are some of the most important tools that people should have on hand to make their scouting really impactful?
Yeah, so I've kind of mentioned a couple already. We've got those yellow sticky cards front and center. Those are great tools for monitoring. We typically don't use those for control of anything, but we'll be able to catch and observe things such as fungus gnats, thrips, larger flies. We'll see winged aphids on yellow sticky cards as well. And it's, with careful and strategic placing, you can catch a variety of different pests and monitor for them, just kind of creeping into your facility. Another thing that you definitely want to have on hand is some sort of magnifying tool. So we've got a hand lens over there on the left-hand side. We're typically talking like 10x magnification, 20x, maybe up to 30x on the hand lens, because a lot of our pests are really small and it can be really difficult to identify um, pests that are, we can barely see them with our naked eye or we can't see them at all. So having that hand lens is really important. And then some people like to use microscopes as well for the super tiny ones.
Great. Peter, have you seen anything else out there that growers find helpful?
Yeah, the other tool that works pretty good is there's a lot of different hand lenses that you can add to your iPhone or any phone device so that you can take both pictures and video. And so the better the quality that you can get in the picture form to turn it back into our technical department, the better they can help diagnose the problem or the situation. Because a lot of times it's just looking for different characteristics, say on an aphid, to understand which aphid is causing the problem. So the picture is worth a lot in value of quality of the way it's taken.
Good. It's good to know those tools are so readily available out there. Erica, when we find insect or mite pests, sometimes people are controlling these with BCAs. Sometimes they might want to turn to a spray. How do people know which products are safe to use on cannabis?
Yeah, so this is a really complicated question, unfortunately. And it really depends on a couple things. So cannabis and hemp, they might be the same plant. They're the same species of plant with a different chemotype or, different THC CBD production. But unfortunately, they are regulated very, very differently when it comes to pesticides. So for hemp, the EPA is actually maintaining a list of pesticide products that have hemp on the label. And lots of pesticide suppliers and manufacturers are pursuing adding hemp to their labels. So this means that they've been approved for use with hemp. They've done some testing to study safety with the crop, and they're now federally approved. So at this time, there's actually 59 pesticides out there on the EPA's hemp list. So that's great. That is developing, and that would apply throughout the US. When it comes to cannabis, unfortunately, things get a lot more complicated, and that's going to depend entirely on what state you're in. So a lot of states, not all of them, but a lot of states do maintain lists of pesticides that they have approved internally within that state for use on medical and recreational cannabis. And oftentimes you're going to want to check with your regulators to see, is this pesticide on our approved list for our state? And what are the recommendations for those pesticides? But, like I said, that's going to depend entirely on what state you're in. Some states, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your view of pesticides, only allow 25B, which are generally regarded as safe pesticides, things like horticultural oils, oil extracts, citric acid, things like that. They'll only allow that type of product to be used on cannabis. So check with your state regulations if you're growing cannabis, medical or recreational. And if you're growing hemp, you can check with the EPA and your state's hemp program. Just make sure that they are following the EPA's list.
Good. And thankfully, we have some good effective products that fall into either category, either EPA registered or 25B. And we understand how they work. So we're here to help you, help a customer decide how to proceed. And one last point on chemistry that we always want to remember is the label is the law. So applicators are responsible for making sure that they are applying product in a way that complies with the label. Now we're going to change gears entirely. Let's talk about lights. There's a broad question that will get asked frequently. Peter, I know you get this question a lot, and Erica, you do too. Which lights are best for my crop?
Yeah, so this is another big question that we've been seeing a lot of good research on. And to answer that question, we want to understand a little bit about photobiology, or the biology of how light interacts with plants. So when we think horticultural greenhouse lights, for a lot of people, what comes to mind are those red, blue, blurple type lights. And the reason why is that red and blue lights are typically the wavelengths that are most efficiently used in photosynthesis. So red and blue light drive photosynthesis the best. But when we oversupply red or blue light, we do tend to see some morphological or physical appearance changes to our crops. When we apply a lot of blue light with a lot of crops, what we'll see is that those crops tend to be shorter, stockier, denser, and leaf thickness can be greater, so we'll have tougher plants. And a lot of times also what we'll see is that we have a lot more pigment production in terms of anthocyanins or red pigments. So if you've got a red variety of something and you want it to be really red, we're probably going to want to apply a little bit extra blue light. Now, for red light, what we tend to see is that leaf expansion is greater, so we'll have wider leaves. And red is the most efficient over blue for photosynthesis, so that's going to generally drive photosynthesis a little bit better, and we tend to have some electrical savings as well. So red lights and blue lights, they have different morphological effects, but they can be uncomfortable to work under. So oftentimes growers will choose a broad spectrum white light that just has all the colors in there. And what we tend to see with this is a good general growth promoter if you're just applying a broad spectrum light.
Peter, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, so the biggest questions when we sit down with a customer is power available. So in order to run lights, it takes electricity. And so the originators that people used to extend their days were HPS and metal halide. And as Erica said, HPS is a broad spectrum light. which uses a lot of electricity, generates a lot of heat, and a ceramic metal halide, which goes more towards that blue light as she was talking about. So that's the first hurdle we go over is to look at that and understand the crop they're growing and what type of light we need.
Very good. We also get a question very frequently about basil. And it comes up about this time of the year when people are thinking about their production and their customer base and how much basil their customers would still like to have year round. How can growers increase their basil production as they come into the winter months? Peter, what would be your first thought on this?
So first thought backs up the same question we just had with lighting. So in order to extend your season, you need some type of lighting over this crop, whether we're using HPS or LED technology. The plants require an extended day length. The other big issue is, as we talked before, environmental. You have to control both your heat and humidity in this space in order to grow a basil crop.
Thanks, Peter. That's good to understand. Let's turn to irrigation. As folks are getting into cannabis, maybe coming from ornamentals, and ornamentals, we do a lot of overhead irrigation, we do a lot of hand watering, we use a lot of booms. Certain crops in ornamentals, we use drip irrigation, but in cannabis, we tend to do things in a manner that will avoid getting that foliage wet. Can you talk a little bit about this, Peter, how people typically go about irrigating their cannabis crops?
Yeah, so some people in the industry still feel hand watering is the best. We tend to try to prove that a drip irrigation system actually can do a better job because it's precision. We can precisely put the same amount of water into every pot at a set time interval and keep everything uniform. This crop of hemp and cannabis doesn't like to be wet and doesn't like to be dry. You hurt the plant either way. It actually likes to be moist. So depending on as we talked earlier, type of soil that you're growing in or media that you're using will dictate your watering style and even the size pot. We don't like to use sub-irrigation or flood systems in this crop because of disease issues. We don't have a lot of curative products, so therefore we like to water each plant individually and not share the water source one to the other in case there is a disease issue.
That's a really important consideration because, as you said, there are virtually no strong controls for Pythium available for cannabis. So that would spread very, very easily if we had a shared water source.
That is correct.
Very good. Let's think about some equipment next. Horizontal airflow is something that traditional horticulture, ornamental horticulture understands very, very well. And it might be something that's newer to some of our CEA growers. Why do we utilize HAF fans in a production space? What's the point? Peter, do
So
you have thoughts?
the idea with HAF fan is, as it's stated, horizontal air movement. So if you're in a greenhouse and you open a sidewall vent or has fans or even a ridge vent, there's pockets of cool or there's pockets of warm air in that space. So the idea of the horizontal airflow is to move that air around kind of in a circular motion to blend all that air back together to even out the temperatures and the humidity levels in that entire space or structure.
Okay. Erica, what's a misconception around airflow in a crop space? And this is a very common thing that we see in cannabis production.
Yeah, so one misconception that we see is simply a misunderstanding of how much airflow is actually needed to be able to have good circulation within a greenhouse. So one test that's pretty common, pretty classic one to monitor or just simply observe your airflow conditions are to cut out a little strip of newspaper and hold it up and see if that little strip of newspaper is moving in airflow. And we're not talking about flapping around or being held horizontal due to how strong the air is going. We just want it to be gently moving a little bit, just show that there's some air movement. And that's typically enough for us to have air circulation. And the reason why we don't want to see flapping newspaper strips or, really strong wind and creating a wind tunnel is that when we have really high airflow, what we'll see is that plant stomates actually will close to cut down on transpiration and cut down on plant stress because they're sensing that there's a lot of air movement in the environment and there's a lot of opportunity for water loss. So with higher air movement, we see closed stomates and we may see issues with nutrient movement through the crop due to less transpiration.
All right, good to understand. And that's probably why if we're walking through a greenhouse and there is an area right next to a fan, that those plants are always smaller at that point, right? Their growth has been restricted by that air movement.
Yeah. A lot of our plant growth, is driven by transpiration. And if we're cutting down on that transpiration, we're going to see slowed down growth. We might even see things like tip burn, like we discussed earlier.
Yep. All right, we have one more crop culture question. As people are looking to support more regional food supply chains, berries are coming up as something that have strong consumer demand. Peter, what can people do or what things should they be thinking about to be successful with hydroponic berry production?
So the big thing is strawberries are no different. You have to understand strawberries. So strawberries don't like to grow in super warm climates. It takes a certain time of the year, certain temperatures, certain lighting. So you need to look at your geography, where you lie, and how you can do it. Next is absolutely the genetics. You can't take traditional strawberries and grow them. In some cases, they're pre-vernalized June berries or ever-bearing berries. And there's a lot of suppliers around, so you need to make sure you buy them from a reputable source. And then there's several ways to grow them. More and more are coming out. They can be grown in what we call trough systems, hanging suspended in a greenhouse. They can be grown in core 1 meter grow bags set on a bench and punched in and watered. So there's a lot of ways to do it. Strawberries have become a big part of people's lives, and they want local strawberries year round. So it has become a big sparked question where they can tie it in, not just doing it hydroponically in a greenhouse, but actually tying it to their outdoor production so that the two together extend their season of offerings for strawberries to the consumer.
That's an exciting development and certainly supports our view on controlled environment agriculture supporting a stronger, more reliable food chain. So we'll be happy to help people learn more about how they can work strawberries into their production. Thank you, Peter. Before we wrap up here and give you a chance to submit some additional questions, we do want to point out that all of our Expo participants, all of our suppliers listed on this page have some sort of Expo special. So please take some time, visit their booths in our virtual Expo and see what they have to offer. It's a really good time to make some purchases. And a lot of these offers, the ones listed here, are only day of show. So this isn't something that you're going to be able to have available to you weeks from now or months from now. So please go visit our folks, chat with them, learn about what they have, and save yourself a little money along the way. Otherwise, we're going to wrap up now by thanking you for being here. Thank you, Peter and Erica, for sharing your thoughts and all of your information. If you, our viewers, have additional questions, you can chat with us. Hit that chat icon on your screen, type your questions in, and Peter and Erica will be able to respond to you. Thank you so much. Thanks for being at the Expo, and thank you for your business. Thanks, Peter and Erica.
Thank you.
Thank you.